Hello and welcome to GryphonArt, and more specifically to part 2 of this Ferrero Rocher Pyramid tutorial. Now, if this is your first encounter of this project and you are interested in making the box, then you do need to go to part 1 of this tutorial, and you will find a link for that in the description area for this video. For those of you who are looking to complete the project, we're now just going to be looking to create these tray components, the pillars, and then just generally finishing everything off. Now the first thing that we are going to be tackling are these individual trays, so I shall be getting everything set up for that and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so for our trays, we simply need 3 pieces of card of varying sizes. Now, for those of you who aren't already aware, there is a free downloadable PDF document to accompany this tutorial, and that can be found on my website at gryphonart.co.uk, and there is a link to that in the description area for this particular video. Now, all the card sizes that you require, along with scoring information, basic notes and some diagrams, they're all available in that document. Right, so returning to our trays, we're actually going to be starting out with our card sizes, which are 3 inches square for the smallest tray, 4 3/4 inches square and 6.5 inches square, and we're going to be taking a very similar approach for each of these trays. Now, to prepare our pattern in each case, we're simply going to score at 3/8 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch on each side of our square piece of card. So it's just a question of rotating the card and repeating that process. So 3/8 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch, and then 3/8 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch. So you're ending up with this grid style pattern with these check effect in the corners. So that needs to be the case for all 3 components. So I will get those other sizes of card to that stage and come back to you at that point. Now our next task is to fold and crease all of our lines, and I have started this just to remind you that when you're doing this task, just to make sure that the score lines on one side of the card line up with the score lines on the underlying piece of card. As long as they continue to run in straight lines, you are keeping your component nice and square. So, that's really just a reminder, or for those of you who are new to this kind of craft. So I need to do that to all of my 3 trays, so I'll get them to that stage and come back to you at that point. Right, so that's all my 3 tray components to the same stage, and that means we can start preparing the pattern by removing excess card, and that means that we need to remove the 3 corners on each corner of this square, and I'm going to do that by simply cutting away the fold line in all cases, because if you haven't heard me say it before, that fold line gets in the way of the construction process. So that's all we're doing, cutting this side of the fold line so that we're getting rid of that as well, and that's going to leave us with this corner shape here. So I will do that to all these 3 remaining corners, and then I'll bring these other 2 tray components to that same stage, and I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so the last thing that we need to do now that we have this sort of shape going on is to create some little fixing tabs for the sides of our trays. Now all we're going to do with this is to snip in to one side of this flap here, just to create a flap. Now it doesn't matter which way you snip in, but once you've done one like that, you want to do the opposite one on the opposite side here in the same way, and then you want to mirror image that, so you're going to flip the card right round, these are your other tabs, and do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to do that to the other two pieces, and then I'll come back to you at that stage. Right, so with that done, we can now start to build up the sides of our tray. And I just want to say, what you're aiming for is a nice right angle corner. So you're looking for a nice right angle here and a right angle here. So in all directions, just check all the time to make sure that you haven't got any incorrect angle. You want a nice straight right angle when you're fixing these corners. Now, I'm just using my PVA glue as usual, and I'm just going to be dealing with these little tabs in pairs, and I will explain that in case you haven't come across my logic in the past. Doesn't make it right, of course, but it's just something that I found prevents me from getting caught out. So with that glue in place, I'm simply going to draw that up and hold it in place until that glue has taken a hold. And then I'll bring this side up as well, just keeping an eye on how square everything is, as we've already mentioned. And at that point, I can apply some pressure with the bone folder just to really force that into place. Right, so I just now need to do the same to this other end, and this is why I wanted to show you that I do them in pairs, because if I glued that one in and I haven't glued that one down, it can be quite tight to get that tab in. So I just find if they're glued up in pairs, you don't have that situation. Always make sure they're both tucked in at the same time, and then, you know, everything should work out fine. So I shall glue those tabs in place as I've done the previous set, and I'll bring all the other two trays to the same point and then come back to you at that stage. Right, now I have actually come back to you before drawing up the sides of this large tray, and the reason for that is because I actually should have marked the center of these trays whilst they were still in flat form, because it's easy to do, and we do need to know where the center of the trays are for the positioning of our pillar sections. So I'm going to show you with this one what we should have been doing, and it's simply marking a center point by lining up the corners with the ruler and then just putting a line just in the center of the card, and then doing the same across the other diagonal. So it's just going from this corner of this score line to the corner of this score line, so the internal square. You could do this before you even scored if you want, that's entirely up to you. And then a small line will give you that center position in the middle there. So we've identified that, and that's really the time to do it before you've built up the sides of your tray. However, if you found that you've jumped the gun, a little bit like I have done, all is not lost, so don't worry. We've got exactly the same scenario, so if you just turn your tray upside down and do the same thing here. So just on the back. This will be covered up with those pillars. You don't want a really long line going all the way across. You're just doing it roughly in the center so that you can gauge where that center point is. So you can do the same on the little one as well. Now, just because we are going to need to know that central position on the inside of the tray, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pin and just make a hole right through the card, so that I've now got a little pinhole in the center of my tray. So that sort of overcomes that problem. So that's the solution for you, as I say, if you've found yourself in the same position as I have done. Right, so I'll now just finish off this large tray and come back to you at that point. Right, so now that all these three trays have reached the same point and we know where the center position is in our base, I'm now going to just take this little top tray and set it to one side, and that's because we've got a little bit more work to do with this one to allow for that Chicago screw head that we first encountered in part 1 of this tutorial. So the more access that we have at this stage for that tray, the better. So I'm just going to leave it in that state and turn my attention to the other two. Now, in order to finish these trays, it's fairly straightforward. All we need to do is apply a little bit of glue to the side, one at a time. It's best to deal with these, I find, at least. It's up to you really what you do. Right, and then we just simply fold that over the top, and then if you can set it down, hoping that you can see this, just apply your bone folder along that length until that side has actually stuck down. And you do actually need a double thickness of card the bigger you go on trays, because otherwise with ordinary 300 GSM card they're just not going to have the strength about them. And what this means is you get this lovely soft edge to the top of your tray. So that needs repeating to these 3 remaining sides. So that's straightforward. I can do that off camera. I'll bring the large one up to the same face and then I can come back to you. Right, so now that both my trays have been built to that stage, I can set those to one side and return to my little tray and do the extra little bit of work that's required to recess that Chicago screw. Now, just as a reminder, because I want the connection between my tray and my pillar to be a strong one, so that that tray isn't easily going to be knocked off its post, I've opted to use a little Chicago screw. So the introduction of some strong metal is going to hold these two components together, and the same in the middle here and again in the base. Now, as I suggested in the first part of this tutorial, if you feel that's overkill, or you have a particularly strong glue that you're confident in and you feel that there's no need to utilize those Chicago screws, then you're not going to need to bother with this layering process that is occurring in this top tray. You might want to just put essential embellishment for effect, but any reference to punching holes can go unheeded because they are only there for those Chicago screws, and if you're not using them, then you will not need to be punching holes in your trays or in your pillar components. Now, our first task is to create a 1-inch square or thereabouts central embellishment for the middle of our small tray that is 3 layers of card thick and has a 10mm hole in the center of it. So I'm specifically using a Spellbinders die cut, which is called Label 32, and I've prepared 3 of those in advance. Now, I've also taken a sacrificial die cut because I've made a number of these boxes. I just keep this one, and I've simply drawn across from these extreme points to find the center. So I've done that in one direction and then in the other direction to find the center, and I've punched a hole. So that's my central hole position. So I will be using my 10mm hole punch, as we first came across in part 1 of this tutorial, to punch a hole in the center of my first die cut, utilizing that sacrificial piece to position that correctly. So I'll do that off camera and then come back to you at that point. Right, so now that my die cut has that hole in the center, and as I say, we need it to be 3 layers thick, I will now glue that to a second die cut. So we're following the same principle as we did for our base component in part 1 of this tutorial. And then at that point, I'll use that space to punch my second hole. Then I will glue this to my third die cut shape and punch a hole again so that I have the component that I require. So I will do that off camera and come back to you at that point. Right, so now that that die cut shape is 3 layers of card thick, we're simply going to glue that to an internal tray strengthener for our small tray, and that's simply a little piece of card that's 1 3/8 of an inch square. And I think you can probably see that because of the size and shape of this die cut, it is fairly easy to gauge where that central position is just by eye. And so that's what I'm going to do when I glue that in place. Now, you may recall from part 1 of this tutorial that in order to recess this Chicago screw head, we actually need to have 4 layers of card thickness, and this screw head is actually 10 millimeters in diameter, and that's why we're using a 10 millimeter hole punch. So it's that internal tray strengthener component that is making up that 4th layer. So once I've glued this die cut shape in place centrally on there, I will also be punching a hole in the center. So I'll do that off camera and come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we're at this stage with our 4 layers of card, I can now glue that centrally on the inside of this little tray, and the only thing to watch out for here is where we place that central position. So in this case it's a little pinpoint to indicate the center of the tray. I need to just make sure that that pinpoint then becomes centrally placed within this die cut hole, and as long as that's the case, then we're on target. So once that's been done, I will then need to start retaining that Chicago screw. So I will be swapping over to my 6 millimeter hole punch, and I will punch a hole in the center there, and that will then retain my Chicago screw head. So I will do that off camera, and then I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we've got to that point, we can just demonstrate here that our Chicago screw head is now nicely recessed, and it's being retained in position by this base layer of card here. Now, you may recall from part 1 of this tutorial that in order for this screw to be fixed tightly, we need to have 6 layers of card within the screw section itself. Now, I've got 1 layer here, and when I come to the top end of my pillar, there will be 4 layers of card there, so I'm actually 1 missing. So all I'm doing is I'm taking a 1-inch piece of card. In this case it's just a die cut shape, but you know, you can just simply cut a 1-inch square, and I've found the center using that normal diagonal cross method, and I've punched a 6 millimeter hole in the center there. So I'm then just going to glue that in place, and that will give me my missing layer, and it will enable me to screw that Chicago screw up tight, and will also provide some additional strength to my base. So I'll glue that in place off camera, and at that stage I can also finish off this box by gluing down these side flaps as we did with the other 2 trays. So once I've got to that stage, I'll come back to you. Okay, so now that that's all sorted, we've completely made all the provision that we need for that Chicago screw, and so we can set that tray to one side. Now we are going to need to do a little bit more work with these 2 remaining trays, because as we are using those screws, they are at the very least going to require a hole in the center of them. Now there is a slight difference between the trays, so I'm just going to deal with them one at a time, so that you gain a better understanding of the construction process. Now if we just have a look at this middle tray component, you can see that although it's on a reasonably substantial pillar, it's not fully supported. It does overlap the sides of that pillar, and because of that, ideally this does need to be more than 1 layer of card thick on this base area, and so it's going to require an internal tray strengthener. So for that, I'm simply going to be using a piece of card that's 3 1/8 of an inch square, and I found that central position using the tried and tested method, and I will simply glue that centrally using that little central pin head as my positioning point, and then I can punch another 6 millimeter hole in the middle there, and that will give me the final preparation at this point for this little internal tray. Now with regard to this large base tray, this again is only 1 layer of card thick on its base, but it is positioned wholly on our base component for our main box, and therefore it doesn't need any additional strengthening at all. So all we need to do with this particular example is to cut our 6 millimeter hole in the center. So what I'll do, I'll get both of those trays to their required position off camera, and I will just show you the finished result once that's done, so that you know exactly what you're aiming for. Okay, so that's our series of trays now complete. So we've got our center hole in the large tray, center hole in our middle tray, and obviously our center hole in our top tray, and they sit nicely centrally inside each other. So those trays are now finished and just awaiting the pillars, and that's what we're going to tackle next. Right, so the method for constructing our pillars is basically the same. We're simply using different size pieces of card and different scoring positions. So if I start with the small pillar, we're actually using a piece of card that's 3 inches by 3 1/4 inches, and I've placed it in portrait mode on my scoring board, and I'm just going to score at 3/4 inches and at 2 1/4 inches. And at this point I can turn it to landscape. Doesn't matter if you turn it clockwise or otherwise. And again, I'm going to score at 3/4 inches, 1 1/2 inches, 2 1/4 inches, and at 3 inches. So that deals with the small pillar initially. Now for our large pillar, we're using a much larger piece of card, but we're still placing that in portrait mode. The card size is actually 5 1/2 inches by 10 inches. So in portrait mode, we're now going to score that at 2 inches and at 3 1/2 inches. So it's still going to have the same height as the pillar above it. So we can now turn that to landscape mode, and we're going to score at 2, 4, 6 and 8 inches. Now at that point, both of those components need to be folded and creased, so I'll do that off camera and then come back to you when they're sorted. Right, so our next task, having folded and creased all of those lines, is to cut away, including the fold line, this corner section of card here. Now, we also need to do the opposite corner, one on the facing side. And then we're going to create flaps by just cutting into these, just down the middle of the crease line to the first fold line. So just down the middle. And that's creating a set of fixing flaps at the top there. So I need to do the same to this bottom row and then reproduce this scenario on the larger pattern piece. So I'll do that off camera and then come back to you. Right, so now that both of those components are in the same state, we can turn to look at these holes that we need for our Chicago screw. And what that means is in one end of the box only, doesn't matter which end, but on all set of flaps on one end of the box, we need to punch some 6mm holes. And they need to be in the center of the top of our pillar. Now the problem that we have with that is that if you were to work out the center of one of these flaps in the way that we've normally done, actually when you're layering them on top of each other, that central position changes. So if I just put these flaps down here, I just want to try and explain that a little better. So if we had found the center of this flap, for example, and punched a hole in the middle, you can actually see we've got extra card here. So what the center of that flap is not actually the center of the end of our box. So in order to get round that, what I do is I number up my flaps in the order that they're going to go down. So dry run, that's flap number 1, that's the first flap to go down. Then we've got number 2 going down, then number 3, and then number 4. So I know exactly what order they're going down, and at that point I can actually find the center of the top of my box using the same technique as we've done before, but going from the corner of the box to the corner of the box rather than using the flap. So it's just the same sort of thing. Oh, that's shifted. Okay, so at this point I can punch the first hole, 6mm hole. So I think for clarity I'll do that and then I'll come back to you once that's done. Right, so that's my hole punched and those flaps put down in that order. So number 1 tab down first and the 4th one down last. Now at this stage you can probably see that hole definitely doesn't look central to that flap, but it is central to the top of my pillar. So I can now work through those tabs by simply drawing around that hole, and that's giving me the position for the hole in the tab underneath. And so I'll punch that hole, put the thing back together, then draw a hole, and so on until I've got 6mm holes in all of these end tabs. So I will do that and repeat that to the larger pattern piece, and then I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so those are my 4 holes punched. They're all 6mm, and I'm hoping that you can see that they're all lining up really nicely using that method. Now, they're all 6mm holes on this end of this pillar. But on the other end of the pillar, we are going to have a different combination of hole sizes. And I would just like to explain that to you a little further in case you need to make any adjustment for your own Chicago screws. Now this end of the small pillar with 4 6mm holes is going to go up against this little tray. And the reason for that is because, if you remember, it's that 6 layers of card that we need to make that Chicago screw tight. So we've got 4 tabs here, and then we've got the bottom layer of our tray plus this strengthening section. So that gives us our 6mm holes. That's difficult to say. So that's why they're all 6mm at this end of the pillar. Now at the bottom end of the pillar, that's joining up against this little tray in the first instance. So we've got 2 thicknesses of card on this middle tray that's got 2 6mm holes. So if we had 4 6mm holes here, it would be too much, only because we've got that pillar there, but we've still got to attach this tray to a second pillar. So what we want to do on the top of our large pillar and the bottom of our small pillar, we've got to divide this number of holes. So we're going to put 2 6mm holes in the bottom of our small pillar and 2 6mm holes in the top of our large pillar. Now we also need our Chicago screw head to be able to come up against a 6mm hole. So in the remaining flaps we need to punch a 10mm hole so that that screw head will go through and can effectively be tight up against a 6mm hole. So I hope you understand. It is a little bit confusing, but once you realize what's going on, you can get a better understanding of that. So basically what that means is this end where the 6mm holes are in our little pillar represent the top of the pillar, and this end where the 6mm holes are in our large pillar represent the bottom of our pillar, and the other ends are the point where they come together. Now I have already started to punch the holes in this larger component just to sort of give you an idea of how to proceed. So you're taking the same approach as you did with the first set of holes. So you're just numbering your tabs 1, 2, 3, 4 and lining everything up. So you find the center, punch your first hole and transfer it through to the one below. At this stage, you can still transfer the position of that 6mm hole onto flap number 2. But when you come to punch that hole, instead of using the 6mm punch, you're going to use the 10mm. And it's just as well to use an existing scrap piece of card with that 10mm hole already punched in. And then you can find where that 6mm mark is positioned centrally. And then your 10mm punch is just going to slot over the top, and your punched hole should be in the correct position. And then you can repeat that process that you've used previously with that 10mm hole to find the center position for the first flap to go down. So I'm hoping that that's clear. I will now get both of these pattern pieces with that pattern of holes in those end flaps, and then I'll come back and show you the result, and hopefully that will provide you with a little bit more clarity. Okay, so all the holes are now punched, and I do hope I've made myself clear, but this is basically the scenario that you're looking for in both cases. So this is the same for the large component as for this smaller one. Now, I should say that there is a diagram of this available in that PDF document, so that's there to help you as well. And failing that, if you really get stuck, don't hesitate to just send me a message through the YouTube system, and I will try and get in touch with you and help you out at the earliest opportunity. Now, before we go any further, and just to save confusion at a later date, one thing I found is advisable is to note which is top and bottom of these pillars, because once you've constructed them, the ends will both look the same. So if we take the side with 6 holes, and we know that these are going down in number order, with the highest number, certainly in the way that I'm choosing to do it, being the last flap to go down. So that will be visible when the box is constructed. So it is just advisable to write the word top on that top flap, so you know that all the holes there are 6mm holes below it. Now, bearing in mind that it is the opposite scenario with the larger pillar. So we've still got, the flaps going down in order, and it's the highest number for me that goes down last. So that's number 4. But in this case, this is actually the bottom. So it's just advisable to label them up, because it won't necessarily be clear once these components are constructed. That's just a tip for you. So the next thing that we need to do is to sort out our Chicago screws, and it's the non-screw head end that we're going to be fixing in place first. And they need to go in this set of holes where we've got a complete set of 6mm holes. Now, bearing in mind that we want the Chicago screw to pass through every single 6mm hole, this component needs to be fixed to the back of, so it'll effectively be in the inside of the box, to the back of the first flap to go down. So it will then pass through all the remaining flaps. And it just needs to be located centrally in that position. Now, I am going to be using a combination of glues, but I'm also going to be making use of one of these little square bits that I cut from the end of the pattern piece. And I've just trimmed it back down so that I can use it to glue over the top of that Chicago screw head in order to help retain its position. So that I've prepared slightly in advance. Now, against the metal, I am going to be using my Liquitex gel mat, because that tends to coat with metal better than my PVA glue. So in the first instance, I'm just going to apply a little of that on the ridge of that metal, and hopefully that will help to hold it in place when it's dried. But obviously it does take a lot longer to go off than my PVA. So it's good to use a combination, I think. So I'm just going to make sure that that is the first flap to go down, so number 1 in this instance. Pop that in place and make sure that it's positioned centrally within that hole, and that can just go down. Now at this point I can apply some glue to the back of this piece of card, and I want to apply quite a lot because that's going to soften that card, and that makes it easier to be molded over the bulk which the end of that Chicago screw creates. So just place that over the top there. Just make sure that stays in its position. I'm not particularly worried about how much mess I'm making here. It's helpful not to have too sticky fingers though. There we go. And it's just then a question of getting the corners down, I feel, in the first instance. And that starts to secure that Chicago screw. And then once you're fairly sure of that position, you can come in with that bone folder in the normal way and just apply pressure all the way around until you're happy that that is secure. So I'm going to do the same thing to the number 1 flap on the smaller pillar pattern piece as well, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so that's those 2 screw head ends securely in place, and I did just want to show you a little bit closer how tightly I've worked around that screw head. And the reason I've done that is because I do want to try and secure it as much as possible. Once this pillar is constructed, I've got no access to this screw head at all. And what I want to avoid happening is for when I come to tighten that Chicago screw, this part of that screw swivels in place so that the thread doesn't tighten at all. So by trying to get it as tight as possible within these 2 layers of card, I'm taking every measure to avoid that. Now these trays do require 3 Chicago screws in total. So we've already put 2 ends in, but we've got one last one to fit, and that is also going to go into this smallest pillar. And it's going to go in the back of the first of the 6mm holes to go down. So again, it's a non-screw head end, and it's going to go in flap number 3, which will be located within this component below flap number 4. So 2 layers of, or 2 thicknesses of card will pass through the Chicago screw at that point. So what I'll do is I will also glue this one in place using the same technique. So I'll just trim down a piece of that card from the corner, apply the 2 separate types of glue and fix that in place. And when that's done, I'll come back to you. Okay, so now that that job's done, I just thought I'd bring that back up to the camera for you so that you had a better visual of exactly where those screw heads are positioned at this stage. So now that we've completed that task, we can actually form the sides of our pillar components, so we can join the edges together. And all I'm going to do there is to apply glue, and I've returned to my PVA for that, to the whole of this end flap area here, and that just provides a double layer of card on one side of the pillar, and it just adds to its strength. So we just simply push that to the inside of the box, line everything up on the outside, line up your fold lines along the top and the bottom just to make sure that you've got everything positioned where it needs to be, and then just wait for that glue to take a hold. And once that's happened, you can apply your bone folder on the inside of the box as well to further secure it. So I can also do that to this larger pillar component, so I'll do that off camera and then I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we've got both pillars to this stage, we can now start to look at joining the ends of them. And as there are slight differences, it's best to just do these one at a time. And I'm going to deal with the little one first because we can actually seal both ends of this particular pillar. Now it doesn't really matter which end you seal first, and it's quite straightforward. I'm just going to be using my PVA glue to layer those flaps up. Now, the only thing I would say is that because this top end has got this screw head that needs to pass through 3 layers of flaps, I find that it's easier to put that one down first because you've still got access to the inside of your box and you can apply pressure to help you get all of these flaps into the correct place. So all I'm going to do first is to glue the top end down. I'll apply glue to each layer and put them in place so that the screw head goes down first. So that's flap number 1, 2, 3, and then finally flap number 4. And then at that point I can apply the pressure from the inside and make sure that they're all positioned properly. So I'll do that one, and then at that stage I can put these layers down as well. So number 1 first, then number 2, then number 3 with that screw head in place, and then number 4, and that's less problematic. So I'll get that done off camera and then come back to you at that point. Right, so that's our small pillar totally sealed up and ready for strengthening, and I've also sealed up the top edge or end of my large pillar section as well, but we do need to leave the bottom end open because our slotted screw head for our Chicago screw is going to be located inside the box, and we're going to need access to that to tighten it up. So we do need to leave this end open at this point in time. Right, so our next task is to sort out our pillar strengtheners. But it is getting late and I feel as though I'm beginning to be likely to make mistakes. So I think what I'll do is I'll end everything here and I'll come back to you in the morning and we can get this project finished. Right, so a good rest and a fresh cup of coffee have worked wonders, and that means that we're able to turn our attention to our pillar strengtheners. Now I would say that in the first design of this box, this component did not exist. But what I experienced, particularly with this small pillar, was when I'd applied glue to, between the two components that I needed to join, so that the trays and the top or bottom of the pillar, and then applied pressure. Let's get rid of that one. So when I came to apply pressure to make sure that there was a good contact between the bottom of the tray in this case and the top of the pillar, there was a tendency for this small pillar particularly to buckle along its length, and that was a clear indication to me that really a single layer of card for this component wasn't really up to the job, and that's where these strengthening sections came into being. Now I am going to start out by dealing with these two strengtheners in tandem, because as you might expect, the large and the small version have quite a lot in common. Both pieces of card are 1.5 inches high, and that equates to the height of our pillars as well. The length of the card for our large pillar is 11 5/8 of an inch, and that is over length, and similarly the over length for our small pillar is 4 1/4 inches. Now we are going to be largely fitting to our pillar sections, and I'll explain why we do that in a little while. But we're going to have a starting point, and that means for our large pillar we're going to score at the 2-inch mark, and for our small pillar, this is in landscape mode, we're going to be scoring at the 3/4 inch mark, and that just represents the width of our pillar sections. Now at that stage we can get rid of our scoring board, so I'll sort that out and then come back to you. So our first task is to simply fold and crease those score lines, and as that's straightforward and you know what you're doing, I've already done that off camera. Now I am going to be working now with just a single pillar at a time, so I'll start with the small pillar and I'll set this larger component to one side for the time being. Right, so if I bring in my finished small pillar component, one of the things I want to just remind you of is the fact that we had a complete flap. When we joined the sides of this pillar, there was a complete flap area. So this side of the pillar, where we've got this raw edge on this edge, this is a double thickness layer of card already. So the remaining three are just a single thickness of card. So what I don't want is to have an additional double layer of thickness card here, because again I'm going to be going round 5 sides of my box in effect. So all I'm going to do, just as a reminder to me, is I'm going to mark the opposite side of this double thickness layer. So any mark will do, and that's going to be my starting point, so I will always come back to that. So all I need to do, I'm going to be fitting to my box. Now the reason for that is because we're going on the outside of those 3/4 inch score lines that we made. That means that actually this measurement from corner to corner across those folds, by the time we reproduce that on here, that's going over the outside of those edges. So it is going to be slightly larger than 3/4 of an inch. And that difference in measurement will be dependent on the thickness of card that you use. So it's always best, in my view, to fit to the box in those instances. And to do that, we simply place our first corner in place where it needs to be. And then at that point, we're going to make a pencil mark where the next corner occurs. Just a little tiny pencil mark. So it's just there. Now at that point we can bring in our scoring board, and we're simply going to place that pencil mark on any groove. Hope you can see this. So I'm placing that pencil mark on that 7-inch groove on my scoring board, and as long as I then keep the rest of the component tightly up against this raised section here, I know I'm going to end up with a square score line, and that's going to give me my next corner. So I'm simply going to fold and crease that, return to my box, make sure I've got the same starting point so that it's fitting where it needs to, and then simply finding the next corner. And I shall continue in that fashion until this component wraps completely around the box and ends up with a double thickness on this side. So that's all that's required in the first instance. I will finish that off camera, and I will get to the same point with the large pillar as well, and then I'll come back to you at that stage. Right, so that task is now finished, and you may recall that I did mention that both of these strengthening components were over length. So once I've got 5 times around my box, I continue to mark the corners. So even though this is an excess card and not needed, all I do is continue to mark that corner and score it. So I've still got my final corner position. Now at that point, I simply use that corner line to trim away the excess card. So I just cut away any evidence of the fold line, and that's going to mean that I get a nice neat joining seam in the corner of my pillar. So let's just fit that so that you can see. So there we go. That now is giving us a nice neat seam tucked neatly along that corner, so it's less visible. And I had the same scenario with my little pillar, which I've already trimmed back, and there was just a little tiny bit that needed to be cut from there as excess card. Now at this point we're ready to glue our component in place. That's quite straightforward, so I think I can do that off camera, but I do have one bit of advice for you. The method that I've found works for me and may work for you is to just deal with one panel at a time. So in this case, this is my first side of my pillar, so that needs to go in place there. So I will just be applying glue to this face of the strengthening component only, and I'll glue that in place and give it a little chance to go off. Then I'll glue the second panel and fit that in place, and so on. It just means that you don't end up with this long strip of damp card that's gradually becoming distorted. For me, it's just an easier approach to this task. Obviously, I'll leave that to you, but that's the method that I use. I'm going to do that off camera in both instances, and at that stage I will come back to you. Right, so with that job done, the next thing we're going to tackle is, in a very similar way, we're going to pre-fit a little tidy strip for the top and bottom of both of these pillars. Now if I just show you that component on the actual box, it might just make things a little bit clearer for you. So we're actually talking about these little strips that are going just underneath the bottom of the tray above, and just at the base of the pillar at the point where it joins the tray on the bottom. So that's what we're going to be tackling next. Now the reason for that component, and you can leave it out if you don't want it, is because that when we come to fit our trays to our pillars, you can often end up with gaps in between the two components, and you can't always do a great deal about that. But because the tidy strip is quite a thin piece of card, you can generally push it really tight up against the bottom of the tray component, or in the other direction if that's appropriate, and that makes this finish between the two components much more neat. The other thing is, obviously we're adding another layer of card to our project, and that's just going to help strengthen the whole thing as well. Right, so there is a little bit of scoring involved for this component, and we're just working with strips of card that are 1/2 inch wide for both of those pillars. Now for our large pillar, we're dealing with a length of card that's 10.5 inches long, and for our small pillar, the length of card is just 4.25 inches in length. And we do need 2 of these for each pillar, so there's 4 pieces of card in total. So the approach is the same whether you're dealing with the longer piece of card or the smaller piece of card. So we're simply going to be scoring down the center of that strip of card at that 1/4 inch mark, and then we're going to give ourselves a starting point for fitting that component to the box. So we're going to turn it into landscape mode and score at the 1/4 inch point again, and then that's our scoring finished. So I'll do the same to that longer length and come back to you at that point. Right, so as you might expect, once you've scored those components, the next task is to fold and crease all those lines. And I've done 1/2 of the components that we require so that I can bring something to your attention. What I found in folding these longer, thinner components is that it's sometimes quite difficult to actually make sure that these 2 edges of card meet exactly. And all I would say to you is that once you've made a decision which side of this component is going to be visible, so that the side that's not going to be stuck to your box, just check along the length and make sure that there's no card visible from this back section. If it's overlapping at any point, just trim it back a little with your scissors so that it's not visible, and that will enable you to push the component tightly up against the tray section to form that neat join which you're aiming for. Now with regard to fitting to the pillar, we're just going to start out by forming a small fixing tab. Once again, the first thing that I'm going to do is to decide where I'm going to have that join in my fixing tab. And I want to keep all these seam lines in the same place if possible. So I'm just going to mark a little space so that I know which side I'm actually starting with on my pillar component. Now at this stage, I can take my strip and making sure that I've got that decorative side with no overlap facing me, and that way I know that this little bit here, this little end bit, is going to be my fixing tab. So what that means is that this bit at the back is excess card. So I'm just going to cut, and I'm going to angle this just to make life easier. Cut into the corner where that fold line is, and then I'm going to cut away that fold line as well, so that I end up with a small angled tab there. So that is actually going to go on to that corner where I've put that little cross. That's my starting point. Now at this point we can employ the same method that we did before, and this is a choice for you. Actually make sure that when you're fitting this, that the raw edge is actually at the top of the box, not at the bottom as it was just then when I started, so that you've got this nice soft edge that's going to be giving a nice neat finish visually. So we've got that little cross there, so we're starting on that corner, and as I say, we can just mark our position with a pencil where that next corner occurs and take that to our scoring board as we did with the strengthening component. But actually what I've found is that this piece of card is so thin that really you can find that position by simply bending the card around the corner, and then you can fold and crease that. And the reason why I'm doing this in advance, you might wonder why I'm not just simply doing this at the time that I come to fit it. But actually I've got to paint this component, and if I tried to do this once it was painted, the paint surface would crack. So, you know, it's up to you whether you want to be more precise or take this sort of rough and ready method that I've employed here. So I will leave that to you, and then it's just a case of, at this point, cutting off any excess card. So I will get all of these components to that stage, and then I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so that task is now finished for both of my components, and there is just something that I wanted to draw your attention to. These components are actually mirrored for each of your pillars. So you've got one soft edge facing downwards and one soft edge facing upwards. So you're not making them both exactly the same, and that may be pertinent for you to be aware of. Now there is one last thing that I want to do with these components just to finish them off, and it's basically because when we come to fit, it is quite difficult with this size of component to slide that tab in between this area here. It's just you can have a go at doing that yourself if you want to, that's entirely up to you, but I've actually decided that it's a lot easier simply to remove the excess card from the back here, so that you're not ending up with additional bulk with that additional layer, and that way you can simply glue your tab down and then glue the rest of the component down as you go. So all I'm doing here is I'm just at the other end of my component, just make sure that you're on the right side. Just from the back, I'm just taking a section of card below the fold line and just angling it so that I've got this sort of space going on, and that just means that that tab is going to sit in that area and not create that additional bulk. It's going to provide a nice neat finish. So I'll do that with all of these components, and that will finish them off, and then I can come back to you at that stage. Right, so at this point, with all those little end sections having been removed, I can now look at gluing these components together, and it's simply putting my PVA glue along its length. I'll do it off camera, as you know what you're doing, and then bringing those two edges together to form that double layer. Now the only pointer that I have for you here is that when you come to apply pressure, having applied the glue, when you come to apply pressure to bring those two edges together, you are in no way trying to flatten out the component. What you want to do is to try and retain those corner positions that you were so painstakingly put in place. So when you're applying pressure, I hope that you can see this, you're simply going to work with one facet at a time. So you just work your way around and keep those corners in place so that they dry in the position that you want them to be. And what that's going to mean is you're going to end up with a component like this one. I have glued this one already, so that's what you're aiming for. And you can see that that's ready to go. So I will get them all to that point and then I can come back to you. Okay, so having got to this stage, excluding embellishments, all the component parts for this project are now actually completed, and it is just a case of putting them together. So for those of you who aren't embellishing your box, you can either fast forward at this stage in the video or just simply refer to that PDF document, and depending on your skill set and confidence, you might find that there's enough information in that document to enable you now to finish this box on your own. Now for those of you who are going to be embellishing your box in the same way that I have done, I'm now just going to start to talk you through each phase of that embellishment process, because we did already cover the method of each form of embellishment in part 1 of this tutorial, and I don't want to be repeating myself and in effect wasting your time in that process. Right, so the next thing that I need to do is to sort out the paint finish for all of these components that are in front of me. So if we take a look at the finished sample, all of these pillars, including these little neatening strips, have got a coat of paint on them. So that's what I'm going to do now, and obviously I will only need to paint the decorative side of these little neatening strips. So I'm going to get that done and then I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so now I've got the level of colour onto my components that I want. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that as I applied each layer, I also replaced these little reference points that are indicating where my starting point is for applying my little neatening strip. Now the reason for that is because, you know, we did fit the strip to our component for starters, so we do need to start off fitting that in the same place. And actually, as you apply paint, this seam line almost disappears behind that paint layer. So having that reference in place just makes life easier, especially once this component is underneath your tray component. So it's not essential, but generally it just makes life easier for you later. Now at this stage, I'm now able to return my attention to that brick stencil and the brick compound, because if we take a look at this finished box, you can see that I need to be applying little areas of brickwork at random on these pillars. Now we have already covered this method in part 1 of the tutorial, but I do want to draw your attention to a couple of things for this particular scenario. So in the first instance, in taking the approach to embellishment, you just need to remember that you are going to be fitting that little 1/4 of an inch embellishment strip top and bottom of your box, and if you're only applying a small amount of brickwork, you may not want that to extend beneath that embellishment strip. Now, assuming that to be the case, you just need to remember to leave a 1/4 of an inch margin clear of any embellishment on the top and bottom of your pillar component. Now, the other thing I wanted to cover was simply taking your brickwork around the corner of your pillars, which you may or may not want to do. Now, if you wish to do that, all you need to do is place the relevant brickwork. Just trying to find some small ones actually. A let's say there. If you take this brick, these few bricks here, so 1 and 2, if you want to extend those around the corner of your pillar, all you need to do is to apply that mount adhesive onto the back of your stencil in the normal way, covering the whole of the area that you're concerned with, because that stickiness will be retained sometimes even after you've washed your stencil. So if you then apply that stencil in place, fill in your brickwork on this side of the corner, and then once you're happy with that you've completed that to satisfaction, you simply bend the stencil round and release the other side, and that will enable you to continue that brickwork around the corner. So that's just something that we didn't cover earlier, and I thought you might want to be aware of. Now at this point in the project, I really want to completely finish that brick embellishment layer. Now that means that off camera, I want to apply my brick compound to my pillar components, colour it, varnish it, and apply the mortar effect. Now I also want to finish my base component, and you may recall that I didn't actually varnish the brickwork and finish it off on that base component because there was a strong probability that some of that brickwork would occur beneath my base tray, and that would need removing before varnishing and finishing off in that respect. So before I leave you, I do just want to cover that aspect of removing some of that brick compound, just in case you find that you need to do so. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my base tray, line it up with my center hole, and just check around my component to see where that brickwork overlaps. And it's sometimes worth rotating the tray because it's not always square. So, you know, you might want to test it in all sort of aspects just to make sure that actually in some scenarios, if there's a minimum amount of brickwork underneath the component, actually if you just turn your tray around, that might sort the problem out. In this particular instance, I did specifically leave some brickwork in place that I thought would go underneath the tray, and actually that is the case, and that's these two bricks here. So I can just show you by putting a pencil mark on them for you. So it's these two bricks here that are actually not required, and they're going to sit underneath my tray. And you know, you could potentially leave them in place if your compound has been applied very thinly, but just in case that isn't the case for you, it's simply a case of taking a blunt knife. This is by no means sharp, it's an old kitchen knife or something of that nature, and if you just apply some pressure, you can probably see, just gently downward pressure onto that component, it will come away. So I'll just bring that up to camera so that you can see. So it does leave a little bit of a white powdery mark, but that's all that's required. So as long as you haven't applied varnish, it's as simple as that. You can remove any that has ended up in a place where you don't want it. So I will continue to remove that off camera, and then I will finish all of my brickwork off, so get it right ready to go, and then I'll come back to you at that point. Okay, so that's now all my brickwork finished, and what that means is that I just now need to show you this sort of age stained effect, in case that's something that you want to incorporate into your own project. Now I am actually undecided at this point in time whether to keep a crisp, a clean version of this available, because it could be interesting as a comparison. So they do say, if in doubt, leave it out. So I'm working along those principles at the moment. So I'm not actually going to be applying a stained effect to this box at this point in time. So I'm just going to set that aside. Now, in order that I can still show you the technique involved, I've simply used a scrap piece of card here, and I've reproduced that brickwork effect so that I can add some staining in for you. Now I have stuck with the original colour scheme, so I'm still using my Distress ink and I'm using the brush Corduroy, which is what I used for my mortar base. Now I would say it's worth having a play around to see, you know, what you like best in terms of hues and colour tones. But this is what I'm opting for the previous project at least. Now really the technique employed is just to build layers. So you start out with a really watery solution, allow it to dry out and just see what happens. So let's just have a bit of a play around here. So say I want to have a little bit of a water staining going on here. So I'm just going to apply a very watery layer. You know, keeping it spread across a little bit and trying to think about how that might lay itself down in a stained patch. So maybe putting some above this brickwork here as well. Now I will just leave that to dry off for a moment because it's going to make a difference if it's dried out, and it really does need to be allowed to dry each time before you build up those layering processes. So I'll come back to you at the point that I'm happy that it's dried out enough. Right, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to see that that has actually created this very, very pale, shadowy sort of appearance there, and we can build on that as much as we want, but I'm going to speed the process up a little bit by going reasonably darker, still very watery, but reasonably darker. And I'm just going to add in, if you think about where water may run, that sort of thing, so perhaps down the side of this brick section here and underneath, and then you can sort of just do a little squiggle in a way that water may run. And I've specifically left a little drop of liquid at the end there, and that's going to dry a little bit darker. It's already beginning to dry. So I can build up this shadow as well here. So wherever I just want a little bit of stain, I can simply add that in. So that's really it. There's no rhyme or reason, you know. It really is a case of having a bit of a play around on scrap pieces of paper if you're not confident to go straight into your project. And, you know, you may even decide to omit this sort of look altogether. So that technique is the approach that I use. I'll leave it to you as to whether you follow suit. Right, so now that we've got to this stage, the last sort of embellishment task that is remaining is to finish off that liquid leaf colour on the trays and on the main box cover. And that's that same colour that I applied to these the outside of these closing flaps in part 1 of this tutorial. So just so you're clear on what is left to do, I'm going to apply that colour to the complete outside of my main box cover, and I'll probably overlap slightly along the bottom here on the inside, just to err on the side of caution. I shall also apply it completely to all my trays, so the underside as well as the top side, and at that point the embellishments are complete as far as I can go at this stage. So I will get this project to that point and then I'll come back to you. Right, so now that everything has had a coat of paint, we can start to look at the final stages of construction. Now, just before we move on to that, I did just want to say that I have a tendency to overpaint. So if you decide that, you know, there are areas on these trays specifically that are going to be covered by the pillars, and you're not going to paint in those areas, it's absolutely fine and probably better because the glue may take a little better. I do cover the whole of the trays generally because I know that at this point in time access to these trays is going to be much easier than once the pillars are in place. But as always, you know, it's a personal thing, so I'll leave you to do what you feel is best in this scenario. Now, this next process is going to require a screwdriver, so I do like to make sure that I've got that readily available at this point in time. So I do tend to work from the top of the tray down, so I'm going to be starting with my smallest tray and my little pillar. So all I need to do in the first instance is to find that end of the pillar that I marked top earlier in this project, and I'm going to simply apply some PVA glue to the top here. Just spread that about a little bit. I want a generous amount because I do want it to make a good bond. It might take a little bit longer to dry, but that's preferable to it coming apart. Now at that point I need to be checking on two things here. I need to keep this pillar square to my tray so that it's not you know, so that the angles are all lining up nice and squarely, and I need to make sure that I've got this central position ready for my Chicago screw. Now because there's quite a lot of glue there, I will be able to slightly tighten this screw to start to hold the tray in place, but that will still give me the ability to move it, and then I can apply pressure to just bring those two components together. And that's going to need a little bit of time to just dry out, so you know, I'll come back to you once that situation is in place. Now once that's had a chance to form a bond, I can start to just tighten my Chicago screw a little, just to strengthen that connection. Now you don't want to over tighten it, because all that's going to do is push down the center of this tray, and that will mean that it's not going to make a connection around these edges. Now once that's established, I'm just going to show you here, I'm hoping that you can see that there is this slight gap occurring on some of the edges around the top here, and that's why I've included these little neatening strips, because just by gluing these at the top here, and you've got that facility to push them right against the bottom of this tray to make a nice neat connection and tidy up that area. Now that's quite an easy task to do, so I will do that off camera in this instance because we've got plenty of access, but I will show you another one later once this bottom tray is in place, because access then is more of an issue. So I'll sort that out off camera now and come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we've tidied all that area up, the next thing we're going to do is apply glue to the other end of our small pillar and get that centralized onto our middle-sized tray and all squared up, and give that glue chance to go off to create a rigid structure, which will give us a much easier task when we come to fit our next pillar. So that's quite straightforward. I'll get that to that stage off camera and then come back to you. Okay, so now that that is being held in place by that glue, so we've got a rigid structure again, we can now look at our larger pillar component, and we're just going to apply glue to the surface area on the sealed end of that component, line it up with that screw head that's visible inside, and then make sure everything's square in a normal way, and then just position the other end of that Chicago screw. Just tighten it till it takes a hold. You don't want to tighten it at this stage, it's just there to help you to align everything, and then you need to leave it just until you know that all the surface area of this pillar component has come into contact with the tray and you know you've got a bond there. So I shall do all of that off camera and come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we've given that time for that glue to take a hold across the whole of that surface area, we can once again gently tighten up our Chicago screw. Now the next thing that I like to do is to seal off this end now, because we don't need access to that Chicago screw anymore. We've finished with that. But we do potentially have a problem here. We know that we need to be able to gain access with the other part of the Chicago screw, and as you can see, this flap here could potentially be easily pushed inside the box. So there's a couple of things that we can do to prevent that, and I will leave it to you how far you decide to take this. This is really just to make you aware of that problem and to consider how you want to resolve it. Now, one of the first things that we can do is simply take a scrap piece of card and roll it up and glue it to create some bulk, and then we can glue it to the opposite edge of the flap. So glue it in place here, and that's going to at least inhibit this edge of the flap from being pushed down. So I'll get that glued in place and then come back to you at that point. Okay, so with that glued in position, I'm hoping you'll be able to see that that's inhibiting the passage of that flap further into the box. So that's quite a good solution and certainly fills me with a little more confidence. Now there is one other thing that we can do just to improve our situation, and that is, if you remember first of all that these flaps do have an order. So we've got the first flap, then flap number 2 I've marked up, flap number 3, and then 4. So then the first flap I'm going to glue down is this one. So what I'm going to do is apply glue to this area in the normal way, as you've seen me do so many times. But then when I put that into position, I'm just going to take my ruler and place underneath here, so that when that flap comes down, I can then apply pressure over the whole of that area. And when that glue goes off, it is also going to hold this flap in place. So I hope that that gives you some idea moving forward. I will get all of these flaps glued in place and I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we're back to a nice sturdy construction, I can turn my attention back to my needling strips again. Now I did want to demonstrate one of those on camera because with the trays in place we've got less access, and it might be useful for one or two of you to see what approach I take in that scenario. So the first thing that I want to do is to place my pillets in such a way that I can see that little marker that says that's the starting point with my needling strip. So the first thing that I then do is to apply some glue to the first side of my needling strip and that little fixing tab. So one side only. Now at that point I can just pop that in place, so starting at my starting point, pushing down the component so it's nice and tightly up against that tray component, and really dealing in the first instance with the main side and tackling the little fixing tab almost as an afterthought. You know, PVA holds enough moisture that you've got a little bit of time to work. So I can use my bone folder to push that component downwards if need be. And then that does need a little bit of time for that glue to really take a hold before I tackle the next side. So I'm going to give that a moment and then I'll come back to you. Right, so now that that one side has formed a bond, I'm just going to use a little piece of glue on a scrap of card, and I'm going to ease that component out, that little needling strip out, and apply the glue to the wrong side of it as far as I possibly can, sort of pushing it into that corner area, and just again along one edge of the component. So we deal with one edge at a time, And once I'm sure that I've got enough glue on there, then I'll follow the same process. So apply some pressure, use my bone folder to push it down close to the tray component and give it time just to go off. So that's how I approach that task, and I will just keep working around until I've got the complete neatening strip in place. So I will do that, continue to do that off camera. I'll also fit the neatening strip to the top here because access is very easy there, and then I'll come back to you at that point. Right, so at this stage we're really just repeating the process that we used for the small pillar. So all we're going to do is to apply some glue to the whole of the surface of the bottom of our large pillar, and we're going to line that up so that it's nice and square and that Chicago screw lines up, and we're going to allow that to form a bond without actually using our Chicago screw at this point in time. Now once that has formed that bond, we can then look at applying our remaining neatening strip around the base there. So I will get this component to that stage and then I can come back to you at that point. Right, so now that we've reached that point, so all our trays are now complete, it's simply a case now of applying them to our base components. We can bring in our base component at this stage. Now we're just repeating the process that we had before, so we'll apply some glue to the base of our large tray, line everything up in such a way that you can see that Chicago screw connection through that hole in the center there. That's critical. So once you're sure of your positioning, before your glue's gone off, you can lightly just put your Chicago screw into position and gently tighten it, just so that you've got that alignment guide. And at that point, you can double check that everything's in position where you want it to be and give that chance to go off. So it's fairly straightforward, I think. So I will get that to that point off camera and then I can come back to you. Right, so now that our trays are nice and firmly in position, we can tighten up our Chicago screw. Again, don't overly tighten it, you're just getting it to a point where you can feel it's secure. So all you're doing, so just be gentle with it. And that's going to strengthen that component up. Now at that point we can start to neaten up this base area, and that's just going to utilize our last 7.5 inch square component. So just apply glue to the surface of that and then position it lining up these corners so that you just end up with a neat finish. So that's pretty straightforward. I'll do that off camera and come back to you once that's sorted. Okay, so our base is now nice and neat and tidy, and I have given that chance to dry out and just keep an eye on it as that is occurring. You know, we've applied an awful lot of PVA glue to this area, and I just like to make sure that the moisture that's adding to this component doesn't cause any buckling or anything. So I think it's worth just being patient and giving that time to dry out a little before moving on to our final task. Now the only thing left to do now is to cover this remaining Chicago screw head, and we're going to use the last of our die cut shapes for that purpose, and it's simply a case of applying glue onto the back, sticking it over the top so that everything lines up nicely, and then applying a final coat of metallic paint just to finish everything off. So again, that's very straightforward. I think you can understand what's required there. So I will do that off camera and come back to you at that point. Right, so that's our job now finished. This has been an incredibly long project, and you know, if you're still here with me, then you have both my thanks and my respect. This is probably not a tutorial for the faint-hearted, I've decided. So thank you very much for your support. Now, just to finish things off, I will show you our completed project so that you can just have a look inside that one. And I've got a second version to show you, which is the Christmas version I mentioned at the very beginning of this tutorial. So if I just drop down these sides, I will just show you that I did finish the task off as planned. So if I remove that Ferrero, you can see that we've got a nice, neat finish here. Now, I think you've probably seen enough of this particular version by now that I don't need to take up any more of your time with it. So I'll just set that one to one side. Now, this is a Christmas version in case you're interested. So it's exactly the same box, and I've just put some camels across there because I thought they were appropriate for a pyramid shape. And these are our three kings. So I've got little sentiments here that I've formed with die cuts and computer printout sort of thing. And that's we three kings, bearing gifts, travel afar, and a yonder star. And in that case, I've got Bethlehem just stamped in position there. So that's basically the outside of the box. And then on the inside, as we drop these flaps down, I've just created these little graphics with sentiments for each of the flaps. So we've got Noel, joy, love and peace along these outside flaps. And when we remove our cover, we've got quite a Christmassy theme going on. So I've simply made a few things out of air-dried clay and painted and varnished them up. So we've got some little stockings on the little pillar at the top, and then we've got presents on the pillar in the middle, and on the outside here simply some holly leaves and berries. And that's something I mentioned earlier, that you could have some 3D elements in this area here. There's not enough space here for another Ferrero Rocher. They're too big. They wouldn't allow for this flap to come to the side of the cover. But there's certainly enough room there when you look for some 3D elements, and that holly takes up that space nicely. So that's everything with regard to this particular project. I do hope that in some way that's been able to inspire you, and that you'll be able to join me for perhaps some shorter tutorials in the new year.